Welcome back, everyone. We will now hear the presentation of Rogers Communication Canada, Inc. For the participant appearing remotely, can you please confirm that you can hear us correctly?
I can, thanks.
Perfect, and we can as well. Please introduce yourself and your colleagues, and you may begin your presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Etreaties, Vice Chair Scott, Commissioners Desmond and Nadeau, and Commission staff. My name is Dean Shake. I am the Senior Vice President, Regulatory Affairs at Rogers Communications. I am joined today by, to my right, Ron McKenzie, Chief Technology and Information Officer, Kendall Milne-Bancroft, Senior Vice President, Sales and Marketing, Residential Division, and Renee Duplantis, Principal, The Brattle Group. And to my left, Howard Slaughter, Vice President, Regulatory Telecom, and Christine Pop, Vice President, Wholesale Solutions. In the back row, we have Barry Choi, Director of Regulatory Economics, and Megan McDonald, Director, Competition Council. Joining us virtually is Richard Feasey, our UK-based consultant and an expert on European regulation. Thank you for this opportunity to provide Rogers' views on the future of Canadian broadband and our commitment to our customers. Rogers is poised to make massive investments in the next generation of advanced network technologies. The wholesale framework that the Commission establishes will have direct implications for these investments, as well as the achievement of Canada's telecom policy objectives. It is critical that the framework promote both competition and investment. The long-standing objectives of high-quality, affordable services for all Canadians delivered by advanced and resilient networks fundamentally rely upon continued investment in competing networks. These investments, in turn, rely on a stable and proportionate regime that treats parties equitably and rates that fairly compensate for the massive costs and risks involved with building networks. Ron?
Thank you. Despite Canada's extensive geography, low population density, and challenging terrain and climate, Canada has amongst the world's most advanced and robust telecommunication networks. These networks perform remarkably during the COVID-19 pandemic, absorbing unprecedented spikes in demand, and they continue to meet Canada's ever-evolving needs for connectivity. A lot has changed since the days the connection to the home enabled a mere telephone call or email. Canadians now rely on their broadband connections to support many aspects of daily life and power their connected homes. Thanks to technological advancements, the value of that connection to the home in terms of what it can do for Canadian consumers and Canadian businesses has increased exponentially. For example, the number of connected devices per Canadian household is projected to grow to 21 by the end of this year, and that's up from 15 in 2020. That's a 40% increase in connected devices in just 4 years. The average monthly usage, which just 9 years ago was 58 gigabytes per customer, is now an astonishing 482 gigabytes per customer, an 8-fold increase. And as you know, supporting these evolving demands is neither inexpensive nor easy. Operating and maintaining high-quality networks requires constant and consistent expenditures in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. On top of that are the massive generational investments required to future-proof these networks so we can continue to deliver high-quality, innovative services that underpin the digital economy of tomorrow and allow Canada to keep pace with our global peers. In fact, over the last 10 years, Rogers, together with Shaw, has invested over $20 billion in our wireline infrastructure. Rogers is currently at the cusp of another generational investment in our DOCSIS hybrid fiber coax network, DOCSIS 4.0. It represents a revolutionary change in the cable network architecture, necessitating the replacement of almost every network element and requiring billions of dollars in incremental investment. DOCSIS 4.0 hybrid coax fiber technology will deliver 10 gigabit speeds and allow cable operators to go head-to-head with our competitors who utilize fiber for last mile to the premises. It fuels facilities-based competition for years to come. And as previous generations of DOCSIS technology, DOCSIS 4.0 will continue to evolve to deliver even higher speeds over time. The decisions that you make in this proceeding will impact both the scale and the pace of these capital investments, and it could jeopardize the business case for the most challenging investments, including those in rural parts of the country. Impeding our ability to invest will also distort and potentially even weaken the cable telco facilities-based competition and all the benefits that flow from that. If these investments were not large and risky, our wholesale competitors would be making them, rather than relying on our infrastructure. At a minimum, these competitors must be required to compensate us fairly for access to our networks with rates that allow for cost recovery and sharing of the enormous risks that we're taking. The Commission should also follow the lead of European regulators and focus on ensuring network builders have efficient and truly non-discriminatory access to passive infrastructure, like ducts and poles, to accelerate builds and deliver services. Doing this will stimulate investment, network expansion, and facilities-based competition. Kendall?
As the leader of our residential retail sales team, I see firsthand the impact the network investments made by Ron and his team have had on the retail market. Over the years, these network investments have allowed Rogers to stay ahead of the curve, anticipating and meeting those ever-changing consumer demands with affordable, reliable, innovative services that deliver significant value to our customers. Our network-based competitors have done the same, and today we fight tooth and nail with them to attract and keep every customer. This rivalry has led to lower prices and more choice for consumers, and it is making my job more challenging every day. The data from the Commission and Statistics Canada reflects what my consumer intelligence team tells me every week, that in spite of soaring inflation, broadband prices are falling. The CPI index for internet services fell 10 points from December 2021 to December 2023, and while the CPI for all products increased by 14 points. CRTC data shows that from 2013 to 2022, average end user revenue per megabit has fallen dramatically from $3.28 in 2013 to just 23 cents in 2022. I can attest personally that the broadband market has never been more competitive. In this environment, it is clear that competition is more than sufficient to protect the consumer interest, and there's no basis for new retail regulation. This perspective also informs our position that a wholesale high-speed access mandate is unjustified and should be phased out. Finally, Rogers competes by offering Canadians access to the most advanced networks in the world. Consumer research tells us that reliability is the most important internet attribute for customers. There's no question that the best way to ensure network reliability and resiliency and create sustainable competition and choice for consumers is through network investment and facilities-based competition. Our recent acquisition of Shaw is clear evidence of Rogers' commitment to these imperatives. Dean?
The primary driver of affordability, reliability, innovation, and service availability in Canada's broadband market is, and for decades has been, cable telco competition. In recent years, new providers and technologies like low Earth orbit satellite and fixed wireless internet have begun to exert competitive pressure on Canada's broadband markets. But it is the fierce competition between wireline networks that continues to ensure the policy objectives are advanced and consumers are well served with a choice of affordable, reliable, and innovative services. In this context, the Commission should be focusing on how to strengthen this network-based competition by, for example, promoting network deployment through measures that support fair and efficient access to passive infrastructure, as Ron has mentioned. By contrast, wholesale mandates that are overbroad or that favor one type of network technology or competitor over others undermine the primary source of competition in the market. Canada's retail broadband markets are competitive, and the record of this proceeding does not demonstrate otherwise. There is no market failure justifying the extraordinary level of intervention contemplated in this proceeding. Aggregated wholesale high-speed access does not satisfy the essential facilities test, which has long been a cornerstone of the Commission's wholesale regime. Aggregated access also forecloses efficient investment in competitive transport facilities. We believe there is still a path to a feasible disaggregated solution if the Commission is prepared to work at it and expect more from our wholesale-based competitors. If the Commission instead decides to reverse course and entrench an aggregated solution, we have developed some parameters for an equitable regime that can be implemented with relative ease. First, if you mandate wholesale access to the fiber premises networks, cable carriers should not be burdened with the costs of maintaining and operating access to both DOCSIS and fiber-to-the-prem infrastructure. Access to only one next-generation network per provider should be mandated. Cable carriers should not be required to implement the wholesale service on their nascent FTTP networks. To mandate otherwise would violate the policy directions requirement for equitable treatment of wholesale carriers. It would also be neither efficient nor proportionate given the limited reach of cable FTTP networks, and it would slow the implementation process. Second, if an aggregated configuration is mandated, the disaggregated configuration must be phased out. Duplicative, mandated access configurations are costly and inefficient and would constitute overregulation. In our interventions, we propose a workable solution for increased disaggregation in the aggregated model that will maintain some incentives for wholesale-based competitors to invest without the cost and complexity of maintaining multiple access services. Finally, if the Commission imposes any wholesale customer exclusions, they must not distort competition and undermine investment. Therefore, exclusions should apply in an equitable manner among facilities-based carriers and should apply to both FTTP and HFC. We are especially opposed to the self-serving proposal put forward by TELUS. Howard.
The parameters Dean has described will yield a wholesale high-speed access regime if one is necessary that is equitable and proportionate. However, for it to work, wholesale rates must be appropriate. Below-cost wholesale rates subsidize wholesale-based competitors and are not just and reasonable. They also undermine investment and long-run competition. In turn, harming affordability and the quality and reliability of Canada's broadband infrastructure. Rates must be set to recover carrier-specific Phase 2 costs, a reasonable return, and a sharing of investment risk. Any deviation, even for a short period of time, will destabilize and have a long-standing negative impact on Canada's broadband infrastructure investment. The analysis conducted by the Brattle Group in this proceeding clearly demonstrates this impact. With the competitive landscape shifting, it is more important than ever that appropriate investment incentives are preserved. The starting point for getting the rates right is the Phase 2 cost studies developed by Rogers and other carriers following the Commission's established processes. Rogers' cost studies are extensive and robust. They comply with Phase 2 costing principles and substantiate the cost-based rates we have proposed. If the Commission requires any clarification or further information, it should issue RFIs and build the evidentiary record for its decision. The Commission should not depart from its recently affirmed Phase 2 costing approach in favor of new proposals surfacing in this proceeding, including retail minus. As mentioned earlier, Rogers and other incumbent carriers require stability and regulatory certainty to make long-term investment decisions.
Rogers appreciates this opportunity to provide our views on the future of the wholesale high-speed access framework. If the Commission mandates an aggregated service in this proceeding, it should be in accordance with the guidelines we have proposed. These parameters will yield a regime that is equitable and relatively simple to implement. And, if rates are calibrated properly, one that is consistent with the objectives of the Act and the policy direction. Excessive wholesale mandates will undermine investment. Less investment will in turn undermine dynamic competition, innovation, and network resiliency. These outcomes matter to Canadians and the Canadian economy. The best way to ensure affordable, high-quality services for Canadian consumers and businesses and sustain the digital infrastructure that Canada needs to remain competitive with our global peers is through minimally intrusive regulation and compensatory rates. Thank you. We look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much for your submissions, Rogers. Thank you for participating in the proceeding and for being here with us today. We're really looking forward to the discussion. We have a lot of questions. And so what I would propose is we will start with Commissioner Desmond, see how that goes in terms of timing, and I would propose that we take a break at some point, but we'll just play it by ear. Commissioner Desmond, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. In your opening statement, I'm looking at page 5 of your document, and you just stated, Canada's retail broadband markets are competitive, and the record on the proceeding does not demonstrate otherwise. There's no market failure. So I just want to have a conversation about that. We heard earlier this week from the Competition Bureau, and the Competition Bureau thinks that perhaps we need to look at this issue from a regional perspective, that we're seeing regional differences. So I'd be interested in hearing your views on how the market has evolved from a regional perspective. What's happening out west? Why do we see less and fewer competitive offerings in the west? And how you're seeing the market evolve.
Thank you. I think I'll start. So we don't agree with certain of those observations made not just by the Bureau, but also by TELUS, I think, that describe different competitive circumstances out west versus out east. There is intense competition, primarily facilities-based competition, across Canada in every market we serve. We think markets are defined as local or regional, but in every local or regional market there is very intense competition. So there's no local market that justifies a distinct approach. If I can speak directly to the question of whether or not we have competitive markets, I think each of us probably have some views on that, so I'd like to start from the regulatory perspective, supported by some analysis that Renee Brattle has done. And I think more importantly, you should hear from the business people about what they experience across Canada in every single market that reflects the intense competition we encounter. So we have said that the record of this proceeding, I think, is clear now that there is intense competition. It's primarily facilities-based competition in the majority of markets across Canada. Rogers competes directly with an ILEC competitor. There are also several wholesale-based competitors in those markets, and as we alluded to earlier, we're now facing the prospect of entry from LEO and fixed wireless. We have seen, and I think the evidence has made it clear, that across Canada, prices are actually declining. I certainly share the view that Bell expressed the other day, and some of the statistics it shared, that in the course of just 1 year, broadband prices declined by 6%. Over the course of 3 years, almost 8%. And over the course of 5 years, almost 10%. So the broadband market is competitive, especially when you compare that pricing to other markets where we've seen inflation. And I think another critical component of the conversation is some of the non-price dimensions of competition, which revolve around innovation, investment, new technologies, all produced by a competitive market that's revealed in some of the data on price per gigabyte. And I'll ask Renee maybe to explain a bit more.
Sure, thanks, Dean. In terms of competition metrics, we can look to the CRTC's Communications Market Reports data, and we have figures in our report. Specifically, I would point you to figures 14 and 15 on pages 32 to 34 of our original report that show that across Canada over the 2017 to 2021 time period, coverage and performance, or speed, increased, while when we look at the quality-adjusted prices in this industry, they've been declining. We measured quality-adjusted prices in 2 ways. First, by looking at average revenue per unit of capacity, measured in dollars per gigabit. And then the second measure is average revenue per unit of speed, measured as dollars per megabit per second. Specifically, we found that the price per gigabit has dropped by more than half, from 35 cents per gigabit to 15 cents. And after adjusting for speed, the price per megabit per second decreased by 70%, from 88 cents to 26 cents per megabit per second. So the increasing coverage and performance, in combination with the decreasing quality-adjusted prices, are all indicators of intense competition in the market.
And then you asked us about sort of the regional approach and what we see. So I think some of our other colleagues had spoke earlier about how hyper-intense it is market by market, and that's absolutely what we see as well. And so how we look at that is that means there's great consumer pricing that's happening in different markets. It ebbs and flows for sure during different promotional periods, times of year, network investments, technology upgrades. But we find we're able to, market by market assess how to be competitive and serve consumers, looking at all the different attributes that they care about.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering, though, why we're seeing prices differ so much then between different provinces? So we've heard over the course of this week that the pricing in Quebec is, markedly less than in other provinces. And in regions where there are fewer competitors, we're seeing higher pricing. And, doesn't that call for some type of intervention if we're seeing that difference?
So from our perspective, we are not seeing that same difference when we look at what customers actually come in on from a rate perspective. We see slightly different market dynamics for sure in Western Canada and Eastern Canada based on the competitive environment. But when we actually look at what consumers are buying from us and the speeds and the tiers, we're not seeing the dramatic differences that were highlighted today. And then Dean.
Yeah, and sort of the regulatory answer to that question is, at various points in time, you might see differences in each market. In each market, again, the prices of the product of intense competition. I would strongly caution you against what is suggested to be very intrusive regulation if you thought immediately in response to a certain period of time in one market, you were going to introduce market-specific onerous regulation. I think that would be a mistake.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask you now about the merger with Shawn Rogers, and now that that's completed, and you're in a position to really sort of roll out your services across Canada, how has that impacted your business strategy? And are your strategies different maybe in the West than they would be perhaps in Ontario or in the Atlantic provinces?
Well, I'll start with the transaction. I think one thing we might agree with that Telus said, one of very few things we said, is that there's intense competition out West, and we see an increase in competition. Again, that's not to say that there's not still intense competition out East, which there is. But it certainly confirms the case we made that the transaction was pro-competitive, and as a result of that transaction, competition is increasing and becoming more intense to the benefit of Canadian consumers across Canada. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah. And from a Western Canada perspective in particular, as it relates to the Shaw merger, we actively are looking at different ways of pricing and packaging for those customers now that we can offer them more services. So we do use a bundled approach that we didn't have available to us before, and that's a way for us to offer customers more services for certain households that's a great option for them. And so that's been one of the benefits, and we have seen some of the pricing come down as we're able to offer more services and packaging for consumers.
And I'm sure we'll have a conversation about bundling, but aside from being able to bundle your services, were you able to capture any other efficiencies that would benefit the consumer in terms of pricing or as a result of the merger?
I think from our perspective in the business, the single biggest thing we can offer the consumer is more choice and more options in the pricing and packaging and speeds that are available. And then the synergies that we're also able to get with Ron's team from a network investment perspective and our ability to reach communities faster with the scale that we have, we're certainly looking to take advantage of that to serve more Canadian homes as well.
Yeah, I think from a technology perspective, one of the biggest opportunities we have is to serve all Canadians. And that's through network expansion, through investment in infrastructure, and leveraging the same, instead of two separate operations, looking at how we bring all those pieces together. And once again, and I'll talk more about this, is this investment is generational in terms of lifting the modernization to DOCSIS 4.0. That enables us to deliver fiber performance and speeds to every community, every house that's connected. And so that's the difference versus what house got connected, what house didn't get connected during a construction phase. And so the real power of this is being able to deliver and serve all Canadians. The second part I would say is we've been able to build an enormous amount of expansion to serve communities that were underserved. That's a big part of our commitment and big part of our commitment to the West. And so I can speak firsthand in communities that we've been building on and communities where we've turned up coverage where, for example, there was never coverage. Some on the island in areas from Souk to Shirley to Port Renfrew, sadly, the Highway of Tears, that for years, no operator built coverage in that area on Highway 16. It took 77 helicopter runs of concrete to pour the foundation for 2 towers to create service in that community. That's investment. That's building on infrastructure that we can deliver, and that's why facilities-based investment in this country is so critical to be able to deliver the types of services all across to serve all Canadians. And so as a technologist, that's near and dear to be able to serve.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for sharing that example. You've, if I don't want to misstate your position, but as I understand it, you're suggesting that the mandated wholesale service should be phased out, and in part because the wholesale-based competitors are increasingly owned by large incumbents that are operating out of territory, who, as you suggest, are large and well-financed and can negotiate access arrangements. So you've made reference to being able to negotiate. So can you speak to when you would be willing to negotiate wholesale access on your network?
Yeah, I'll start. I just want to make clear, there's a number of reasons why we suggest that the wholesale mandate should be phased out. I'm not sure it's exactly the way you characterize it. I think there's a number of reasons, including, quite honestly, the disproportionate burden that it has imposed on cable, which was one of the points that the Bureau made and has become a theme of this proceeding that we absolutely do agree with. I think going forward, Canadians are best served by facilities-based competition, and you can consider appropriately phasing out the framework. If you did phase out the framework, as I think your question is leading to, there still would be the opportunity for the negotiation of off-tariff agreements. And I think off-tariff agreements could exist in a regime where wholesale access was not mandated. It could still benefit consumers, and it could still serve competition.
Okay, and thank you for that clarification. I didn't want to misrepresent your comments, and certainly I understand that that's one of the factors that potentially would be why we would want to consider phasing out the opportunity to potentially negotiate arrangements. So could you speak to your experience vis-a-vis negotiations? How would that work in your mind? Who would you be willing to negotiate with? And have you attempted to negotiate access to other incumbents' networks? And what was the outcome of that?
I'm going to ask Christine to jump in on the negotiations with wholesalers. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Dean. So I think broadly, first of all, there's a history of regulated services becoming foreborn over the last 20 to 25 years. And as operators, we have found our way to transition from tariffed arrangements to commercially negotiated ones. So I would expect that through a transition like that, we would undergo the same process, negotiate commercial arrangements that often, both benefit both parties where we can find middle ground, and we would continue to do that with TPIA as an example.
Okay, thank you. We heard earlier this week from TELUS, and I'm sure you had the opportunity to hear their submissions as well. They did speak to the fact that in their view, it was more expensive to undertake construction out west than it is maybe on the East Coast. So I'd be interested in hearing your experience. Is that a similar observation? What are the cost drivers per region, and does it matter?
Building is expensive across Canada, just like competition exists intensely throughout Canada. Building is expensive throughout Canada, but I'll ask Ron to talk about specific regional differences.
Yeah, and there are, once again, when you're building, the way to think about this is the majority of the cost of the build is the construction, it's labor. And so almost 80% of the build cost is construction. So the key is sourcing the labor, having the capabilities to do that. The second area is the terrain. And so there are unique differences across our country. The example I gave earlier is on the outlier, where you make a commitment that you're going to serve a country. You make a commitment that you're going to deliver coverage where there's never been coverage. Cost in those cases is not a factor. It's delivering the service. And so that example is on the upper end of construction, where you're hiring a helicopter to pour 77 runs. It took 77 runs to pour the foundation. In other areas like Northern Ontario, the Canadian Shield, I can't plow. So there's multiple ways that you can install services. The biggest challenge, as I had in my opening statement, is where the incumbents have a unique position is access to duct structure, pole attachment rights, and history. History of being a telephone company. And being a telephone company, they have attachment rights on poles. So in places where I'm trying to serve a remote community, I'm having to pull fiber and having to plow or use other techniques. So hence the costs can be higher. It does vary by terrain. It's not necessarily unique to any one geography because it's equally tough to do in the Canadian Shield of Northern Ontario or Northern Quebec as it is when you're doing mountaintops or areas in the West. It's more the biggest thing the Commission could do is open up access to passive infrastructure. That would dramatically accelerate the pace of infrastructure builders, and we're a builder. That's our focus.
Okay, thank you. Hey, I'd like to have a short conversation with you about investments, and I'm sure my colleagues will be asking you about investments as well. It's been a popular theme this week. As you know, Bell Canada has announced that it would reduce network investments by $1 billion if there were to be a rollout of this mandate. Wondering if you could speak to that. Do you have a sense of, in your view, whether or not that reduction would actually come to pass? What if any, options the Commission has in front of it?
Well, it won't surprise you, we're not going to comment on what Bell said in response to the interim decision about the investment impact. I will say, though, that in 2019, those rates had a serious impact on all carriers and our investment planning and our investment decisions. So I do agree, and this is not commenting on the interim decision or the Bell position, but I do fundamentally agree that distortionary below-cost rates will have a serious and harmful impact on investment and competition over the long-term affordable access to next-generation services. I know you've referred to this a few times, and we heard from Eastlink Lee Bragg about the fact that it's critical to get the rates right. We don't say it's the only thing that matters, but it's certainly the most important thing in this proceeding. You have to get the rates right, and getting the rates right means compensatory, cost-based rates. And if you don't get those rates right, then you'll experience across Canada, and not just in Eastlink's markets and not just the impact that Bell's been describing, but across Canada, every facilities-based competitor on whom Canadians rely for their affordable access to next-generation services will suffer because we'll be faced with difficult decisions, and including those related to investment risk. I don't know, I think, Ron, you should.
Yeah. And I mentioned, and I'm happy to share more, and once again, as the technology guy, appreciate the opportunity to kind of spend some time and share how this actually works. The infrastructure, we're at a real generational point. What I described earlier in terms of what consumers do, we model well ahead what we think consumers are going to want to do in terms of how they utilize their services, what's happening in the home, how many devices are connected in the home. Today, and this has been just in a short while, the highest growth or highest demand of bandwidth, 60% of bandwidth is over-the-top video services that come into Canada through streaming. 60% of the traffic. And so imagine the amount of investment we have to make to carry 60% of the volume of traffic from over-the-top, out-of-country streaming services. So when you look ahead, it's the advancement of infrastructure investment that we're making that is generational, but more importantly, sets up the next phase of what consumers are going to want to do in the home. We saw this during the COVID pandemic. When everyone went into a shelter-in-place across the country, literally overnight, I can share, we saw a 40% increase in traffic overnight. Overnight. When you design a network, you don't need, if you're not thinking 2 moves ahead and you're not investing for the long term, you're not going to design it to have elasticity to take on 40% increase in traffic overnight. That wasn't a planned event. That wasn't something we knew, oh, we have to be ready for in 3 years or 5 years. It just happened. And every facilities-based network in this country held up. Every network. That's because we're all thinking ahead. That's what's key in this framework, is get the rate right, get the framework right. That gave us the elasticity to deliver. And I think as we look ahead, we'll talk about innovation, But that's the part I'm so excited about in terms of what we're going to enable to bring to Canada in terms of new innovative services. So that's sort of the background on it.
And I appreciate that, and I appreciate your reference in your opening statement to the number of devices that Canadians are using. That's really interesting. I am interested, though, as well, in terms of your plans vis-a-vis investments. If there were to be a mandate, have you thought through what that would mean for you and your investments practically if that mandate were to come into place?
Well, we're not going to, obviously, that's going to, invites questions about our internal planning and modeling that could be competitively sensitive. Obviously, we're considering what the impact would be of highly distortionary below-cost rates. We're hopeful you'll get it right, and we won't have to experience that. We're hopeful that you'll get it right with rates that actually reflect our costs. I do want to ask Renee, because we hired Brattle to actually address this very question, what are the impacts of rates that are below cost and how that impacts investment?
Sure, Dean. And I would tie back to what you said a moment ago, that, all facilities-based providers could have their investments impacted as a result of getting the rates wrong. We've undertaken an incremental cash flow analysis, and the one that we've undertaken in this proceeding is fundamentally the same as the one that we undertook in the 2019 proceeding, and in that one we actually did it on behalf of all cable cos, so on behalf of Rogers, Shaw, Cogeco, Eastlink, and Videotron. In this proceeding, we're only doing it on behalf of Rogers, and we've added a few real-world complexities to our analysis from the prior consultation. But fundamentally, we're assessing the impact on Rogers' incremental cash flows that stems from a potential change in the regime itself, or from a given reduction in wholesale access rates. And we show empirically that there would be a decrease in Rogers' incentives to invest and expand its wireless capabilities. And I would just point you to section 4B of our report at pages 42 to 52. But we undertook two analyses. The first, we looked at the impact on the incremental cash flows on Rogers' nascent development of its FTTP network resulting from a mandated regime. So we compare the baseline model today, which does not have mandated access, to multiple scenarios with mandated access, whereby mandating that access induces customers to switch from being a Rogers residential customer to a TPIA subscriber. And the difference between those scenarios, which I won't go into any numbers, they're in our report, shows the effect on their incremental cash flows and therefore their investment decisions. In the second analysis, we calculate the impact on their incremental cash flows for the FTTP and HFC products as a result of potential assumed reductions in the wholesale access rates. So we compare the baseline model that we've come up with using Rogers' proposed aggregated access rates to multiple scenarios where the proposed rates are reduced by 10%, 20%, or 30%, and use that to assess what would be the impact on Rogers' incremental cash flows and ultimately their incentives to invest. And we show that under both scenarios, these changes negatively impact their investments at large and their incentives to invest in the future.
Okay, thank you. I did actually go through the Brattle report, and in particular paragraph 77, there was a sentence that jumped out at me, and it said that one potential impact of resale regulation would be to reduce incentives. Because obviously, as you've said, they'd be less likely to invest, and they couldn't recoup an adequate return. And I think this is where our conversation is going. Doesn't that, of course, depend on the rate that's set? And earlier this week, we heard from Bragg Communications, who said, if the rate is correct, they would be agnostic. So I'm just wondering if, would that be your view as well? If the rate is properly set, reflective of costs, then you could be agnostic.
If you, and I might ask Howard to comment on this as well about our approach to phase two cost. If you adopt our rates as proposed, which are based on a rigorous, comprehensive examination of our costs, a very responsible one, and those are the rates, then the wholesale regime could work and our investments will not be undermined as suggested in the Brattle report. And I know from an economics perspective, you always like to say incentive to invest. Really, this is a question of our ability to invest. I mean, as Ron said, we're builders. we want to invest. We have every incentive and desire to invest. This is really a question of whether we're able to invest, and I think we certainly share Eastlink's view in this regard.
Yeah, no, I don't have much to add to that. I think it's crucial that, that the costs are based on the rates are actually based on our underlying costs, which we provided to you through our phase 2 cost study. So I think if the rate is based upon those analyses, then I think we will be indifferent, although we always do prefer actually having a direct relationship with customers, but from an economic standpoint, we would be indifferent.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to move on now and talk a little bit about this concept of things being inequitable or asymmetrical. There's a history, and this has been talked about this week, a history of the ILECs having a head start, and the system as it exists creates this asymmetric disadvantage, arguably, to the cable carriers. So I think your argument is that your FTTP facilities should be excluded if there were to be a mandate to address that asymmetry, and that would give you the opportunity to continue to provide your services at higher speeds. So I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about how you see this asymmetry and addressing it in a way that you think is fair and equitable.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think it's critical that if there's a wholesale regime, resellers would have access to the networks provided by cable companies and ILECs, but it should only be one network. And in our case, we're committed to HFC. We're committed to next generation investments in DOCSIS, and as Ron explained earlier, to build out DOCSIS 4.0. FTTP is not the core part of our future planning. It really is about that next generation of DOCSIS. So what you really want in a symmetrical framework is two competing networks, in our case, cable HFC against the ILEC FTTP. You want that at retail and you want that at wholesale. There would be significant consequences to us if we had to encounter multiple configurations. If we had to, and I know that in this proceeding, there's still an open debate about whether you need both aggregated and disaggregated, which introduces new complexities. If we had to encounter those problems, or just build out wholesale provisioning for both FTTP and DOCSIS, it would significantly harm our investment, and it would be difficult to provision. I'm going to actually ask Christine to explain a little bit more about how difficult that would be.
Sure, thanks, Dean. I think to say it would be operationally burdensome, to say the least. At Rogers, we take our obligations to provide a good level of service under the current regime very seriously. We've made substantial investments to enable that on our current platforms in the east through a portal, and we're working to extend those same capabilities in the west. So to undertake to enable another distinct technology, and as Dean mentioned, for such an insignificant part of our network, is a significant effort. So that would require setting up a completely different stack of systems, one in the east and one in the west, to enable the whole provisioning process. Everything from serviceability, order placement, service delivery, service activation, truck rolls, service assurance, et cetera. So number one, to have to stand that up and invest in the development of that is substantial. And as we've outlined in our submission, we estimate that would probably take about 12 months. But the burden is also in the ongoing maintenance and operation of those various systems, and again, for such a relatively small part of our footprint.
Okay, so in those areas where you did have FTTP facilities, like what would the impact then be on the consumer?
Sorry, in terms of?
Not if it wasn't available for access by other players, and you had your footprint in certain spaces, but not open for access, and other people couldn't compete with to have access. The competitor then would be left with fewer choices.
there's limited areas of entry for us in FTTP, typically greenfield. I think in most cases where that would take place, there would be an ILEC providing FTTP as well. So again, there would be no harm to the consumer. There would be a high-speed alternative available to them. And I think our ability to continue to grow our footprint and grow FTTP and more greenfield builds would be supported by the symmetrical framework that I'm describing, where we could have some level of certainty, some cost certainty, and a symmetrical framework that lets us focus on our HFC build and be selective about our FTTP deployment, but the consumer would not be harmed.
And just to fully understand the proposal, for that ILEC that was operational in that territory, they potentially could be open for access, and they would be providing access, but in your case, you wouldn't be providing access. Is that correct? That's kind of the concept.
Yes.
There's been conversation this week about the Head Start rule, and if there should be an opportunity to give the facilities-based providers an opportunity to recoup their investments. I'm wondering if you could comment on that or what your views are on the Head Start proposal.
Well, there's been a number of proposals and various contexts, so I'll try and place it in the one that I think you're understanding. I mean, of course, we're coming from a history of where the ILECs haven't enjoyed a long regulatory holiday on their build out of FTTP, which has meant, and I'm going to come back to this point, that cable carries an incredibly disproportionate burden in terms of wholesale access. Most of the resellers are on cable networks, not FTTP. So this concept of a holiday, I think, as Bell explained, with their new builds, they want yet another holiday. And so it's a bit complicated because actually when they describe the rationale in support of a holiday because of their investments, it does make sense to us in the sense that, of course, as you're building out new networks, you want to have some confidence that you can recoup your costs, which means if they get a holiday and if you're going to have a symmetrical regime, we need a holiday, but we don't have a starting point from a holiday. So it actually takes us back to the position that you really should not mandate wholesale access. If there are any holidays, they have to be symmetrical.
Okay, and what if the provider was a smaller incumbent, like Eastlink, for example? What would your views be on a Head Start rule with respect to a smaller service provider? Well,
and, you know, I think very highly of Eastlink and their position in this proceeding and the work they've done, and I view them as a cable peer. But when I think of other cable carriers, you know, even though we're talking about them as being small across the country, in every market, the cable incumbent is the cable leader in that market, including Eastlink in its markets, Cogeco in its markets, Videotron in its markets, and we all compete fiercely head-to-head with the ILECs. So I really think, because markets are local, any kind of consideration of what cable carriers need to support our investments and provide us with certainty applies to all cable carriers. The issue here is there's been a historical asymmetry that needs to be resolved somewhat and certainly cannot be exacerbated to make sure that Canadians continue to enjoy the benefits of cable ILEC facilities competition.
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask the same question with respect to the sunset clause. And you're right, I should probably clarify, but there's been so many conversations about what a sunset clause would look like, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. But maybe you have a view on that, or if you do have a view, what your preferred time frame would be.
Sure. And obviously, we've been listening to the proceeding. I think Cogeco's moved away slightly from its 350K households position. I don't really think you can have a homes passed or number of subscribers position apply equally to all carriers, because we have obviously a different set of subscribers and subscriber base. So I don't think that works. What we're actually asking for is that you rely on HFC competition with FTTP. So we're not really talking about that being sunset at any point in time. You could, at some point in time, revisit in another proceeding, which could be 3 years from now. I've heard that number expressed, about whether because we've grown, because other carriers have grown their FTT footprint, if the exemption no longer makes sense. But we actually are asking for our FTTP, as we build it, to be exempt from wholesale access.
Can you offer a little bit of clarity with respect to when you choose to roll out the FTTP versus maybe investing in maintenance or your cable systems?
I can help with that one. From an investment standpoint, so we typically will look at an area and we'll choose different approaches to technology. So once again, some of the proceedings didn't fully explain when you're actually building fiber to the premises, you want to actually connect every home during the construction phase. So it is extremely disruptive to overbuild an existing facility because you're tearing up neighborhoods, lawns, directional boring into every house or aerial into every house. And so what we do is typically greenfield, so they're new home construction or new areas or an MDU. We use fiber to the premise for those types of communities because you can cover everything with the least disruption to the customer. That's the key. For rural builds, we use fiber because you're typically pulling backhaul into long runs, and so it's you can get a lot more distance. And so that way we use, if we're doing rural communities and remote areas, we'll use fiber, similar to like we do with our wireless and cellular sites where we'll pull fiber to those sites. The benefit of DOCSIS is I have fiber into every community today. We always have. The benefit of this, and that's what I think our competitors sometimes like to not recognize, fiber is in every neighborhood. And all we're doing is converting those optical signals to electrical, just like you would in cellular, except we're transmitting it on a connection into the home. And the power of DOCSIS 4 is just like wireless, where I have all these different frequency bands to add all the capacity. I can add all those frequency and modulation approaches and unique techniques to deliver 10 gigabits to every house. So I don't have to tear up every neighborhood. I have the advantage of being able to connect customers that already have a connection to the house on the existing infrastructure. So what we look at is the least disruption to the customer, what's the fastest way I can deploy, and that's why today we're modernizing at record pace the network to be ready to deliver DOCSIS 4.0. It's a massive investment that we're doing. And so that's where our focus is. We'll choose the technology that makes sense. And as we're starting to see, similar to what we saw in the United States, we're starting to see alternate technologies. So when I go into remote areas now, I do see LEO, low Earth orbit satellites with Starlink, and there'll be many other services that'll come online. It's a wonderful technology for remote areas. And then I'm also seeing fixed wireless, which is one of the investment areas that we look at because we actually see multiple technologies that can be applied to deliver connections depending on where the customer is or how they want to operate or how they want to be served. So that's the focus of how we make our choices.
Thank you. If, in fact, the commission were to decide that a mandate should be imposed, there's been conversation about whether the larger players, Bell, TELUS, and Rogers, would have access inside their own serving territories. So TELUS, for example, was here on Tuesday and suggested that their serving territory would be Alberta and BC, but their access could be outside of those serving areas. So I'd be interested to hear your views on that approach.
And you won't be surprised that this is a conversation that we're interested in having. It's a very important question. We appreciate the amount of time you're spending on it to make sure you get it right. We want to spend some time on it to make sure you don't get it wrong and explain what is sort of the evolution in our thinking as we've listened to the hearing. Sort of on a principles basis, I think you've heard from us today and in our submissions, the things that are most important to us are facilities-based competition and regulatory symmetry. And what we're most afraid of is any distortions in that market that harm our investment, harm our ability to compete with facilities-based players, or that distort competition. So we don't want there to be distortionary rates. Any level of distortion with rates, or even if there are the right rates, we would see further market distortion from self-serving proposals like those put forward by TELUS. And you've already heard from others, and we strongly agree with their position that TELUS's proposal is hypocritical, it's self-serving, and it's based on a misleading premise that TELUS is this plucky regional carrier that's going to provide competition. That's simply not true. And to explore further the impact of the TELUS proposal and what it means, let's explain what it would look like. Rogers competes directly with TELUS, and it competes directly with Bell, and we view ourselves as competing with the ILECs. We compete with Bellus that has the benefits of a network share and some of the problems that arise because of that. So now what you would potentially be creating if you adopted the TELUS proposal is that in every market where we compete, we would be competing against an ILEC facilities player. Out east, that would be Bell. Out west, that would be TELUS. And we would potentially be competing with an ILEC reseller. Out east now, that would be TELUS, and out west, that would be Bell. And we would have no ability to resell on their networks. So what TELUS is asking you to do, quite frankly, is to position them to severely undermine our ability to invest by reselling on our networks when we have no ability to respond as a reseller on any ILEC network. That would be incredibly harmful to competition, to investment, and ultimately to consumers, because it would devastate the facilities-based competition between cable and ILECs that we fundamentally rely upon. And let's be clear, we're competitors. We like to compete. We want to compete with TELUS. We do a good job at it. We want to compete with Bell. We do a good job competing with Bell. We want to continue to compete with them on a symmetrical basis. We're against any regulatory decision that distorts that competitive framework and creates new asymmetries, especially when we've had 10 years of asymmetries between cable and telco. And I just add a couple more points, and I'm going to return to this point. Cable has continued to and will continue to bear a disproportionate burden on resale. So what we're really expecting is, if Bell and TELUS are put in that position, it's really going to be our network that they're riding on. Bell will ride on our cable network out west. TELUS will ride on our cable network out east. They're not really going to be riding on each other's networks. A lot of the reasons coming out of that Bellus network share that they already have that creates the problems I've described. And I actually appreciate the position that Bell took, where they actually said this is ridiculous. And Mr. Malcolmson had some choice words for the proposal, and I agree with those. So I think this is probably the worst thing you could do, is adopt the TELUS proposal.
Okay. I think TELUS does express concern that you might abandon your cable network and become a competitor on the networks of Bell and TELUS. I think even the Competition Bureau states this as a possible outcome of if there were to be mandated. Is that something you would foresee as a possibility? You talked about TELUS and Bell using your network, but couldn't you also use the networks of Bell and TELUS?
We could not in the proposal that TELUS has provided, and I think that's intentional. They've devised a proposal where they could ride on our networks across Canada. We could not ride on theirs. Even outside of that proposal, Ron said this, we'll say it again, we're builders. We're committed facilities-based competitors. The way others have described the fact that Bell, TELUS, Rogers are now entering resale, that doesn't really describe Rogers. We've had a modest entry in resale, but we are primarily a facilities-based competitor. We want to build our own networks, and we want to compete for customers with our own networks.
I actually did have a question about that, in that if I'm correct, you recently purchased Conwave. So I'm curious if you could speak to whether or not that's an opportunity for you to leverage wholesale HSA services as a result of that acquisition.
It's a very modest acquisition. To be honest, This proceeding was part of the rationale for pursuing that transaction. We had to position ourselves for certain outcomes where we might need to have a resale option. It's not a big part of our business. Kendall, do you want to?
So, like Dean said, that transaction happened in Q4, so it's relatively recent. It was with this hearing in mind, knowing if things went a certain way and we weren't able to get the rates right from our perspective, that we might have to pursue different distribution strategies. But we're not actively pursuing that, aggressively going to market with anything right now. And you'll see some of the other folks who were here earlier this week have taken a very different approach, talked about sub-brands that they're putting into the market and other things. That is not our approach and would not be our intention if we can get the rates right and stay focused on our facilities based.
Okay, I think those are all of my questions. Thank you very much for your time.
So maybe I'll look at you. We will take a break at some point. I'd like to turn to Vice Chair Scott, but did you want to take a break now? Do you want to keep going? We're in your hands.
We're in your hands.
Yes, in your hands.
Okay, why don't we start with Vice Chair Scott and see how that goes? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Mr. McKenzie, when you were talking about your network investments, you used the phrase enormous risk, and others this week have described it similarly. I'd like to hear more about the nature of those risks. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about regulatory risk, because at a certain level, investing in a network that delivers a service that people say is essential to every aspect of their daily life, people talk about it like water, people are choosing internet over food. In some respects, it doesn't seem particularly risky. I don't think people think of Rogers as a particularly risky company. Could you just enlighten us as to what types of risks you're talking about?
Sure. When you build, and once again, some of the builds that we're doing, and this came up in other responses as well from other operators, there's no one formula that says, oh, this is what the cost is per house, or this is what the cost to build this is, and this is the year's payback. I have some areas where I probably will never get a payback for that house that I built over 25 years. But it was part of service expansion. It was done for a reason of investment to be able to serve a community as part of a commitment we made. So when we look at these things, we actually look at the communities. We look at penetration rates. So you look at how many houses you think you will serve, how many customers, but you have to earn every customer through your service. So we plan as much as we can the models that say, okay, can we earn the trust and earn the service with the consumers in those communities? And once again, then you have to look at the competitive landscape of what other technologies are there, what other platforms are being delivered, and then you look at the whole package of services that you're going to bring to that customer. So the risk that you take is if you, for example, if you don't get the penetration, your payback periods are going to be years. And so one of the things about the wrong wholesale regime is you could never achieve the penetration rates. So you'll never get the payback. And so when we look at it, you know, once again, and that's going to vary depending upon if it's wide open access, people can go into any community. So you could have high levels of concentration that essentially I look at it and I say, well, geez, should I bother to build or upgrade that community, or am I better off to go to this community? So you create a disproportion for what consumers are going to get. And so when I look at risks, I look at it from that perspective. I look at it starting with the customer and the consumer. And I look at, you know, just as I described, a 40% increase in devices in the home and 60% of the traffic is streaming video. Just we'll look what's next, which is augmented reality and virtual reality. When you have those types of services, you're going to need low latency. You're going to need edge compute. You're going to need computing as close to the customer as you can. And so all those things are the risks of what we look at when we look at what a consumer is going to do and what other services are available.
Okay, thank you for that. That was very helpful. So I think fair to summarize it as really competitive risk, right? So you may not get the number of customers you've been planning for, and then that could be exacerbated by regulatory risk.
Yeah, there's competitive risk and technology risk, right? Because you've got to look at it in both fashions, because you've got to get both aspects of knowing what the consumer is going to, what the house is. The days of just a simple connection to the house are gone. They're gone. You know, for anyone that has a family, all you have to do is watch what's going on with the number of devices and the connected home, and you look at the security cameras and you look at time of day of how people are, in many ways, conducting their work life and their personal life and their entertainment all now from the home. And so that's where getting those aspects right equal to the technology.
Great. I appreciate that. Thank you. So in talking about the competitive landscape, you did make specific reference to LEO and fixed wireless aspect alongside cable and fiber. But are those really substitutable? Is there any home where a customer is sitting there with 4 flyers on the table wondering if they should take Starlink or fiber to the prem? Or are most households really choosing either between cable and fiber because they're available, or fixed wireless or LEO because cable is not available?
So from a consumer perspective, we see, basically, we call it consumer segments, but different consumer use cases dictate different needs for the technology. So to your point, in our facilities-based footprint, very low need for fixed wireless access, but we do have some use cases where it's a backup device, or they might want to use something that's transportable. And so having all the different access types obviously gives us more products and services we can offer. And then absolutely what you were describing in some of the more remote areas where there's one type of access, but we're happy that we have something that we can offer, then we go to market with that as well. But we are finding new use cases all the time based on consumer behaviors.
Okay, so for the bulk of the customers you serve on your cable infrastructure, they've got the choice of cable infrastructure, the telco's infrastructure, or anybody wholesaling. That's really the choice most people are facing, absent the rural and remote scenarios.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
I mean, I think the other point to add here is you need a forward-looking regulatory framework, and you can't look at this point in time and say they're not substitutes. They're becoming substitutes. They're increasingly likely to become substitutes. So you need to think about what is the future. We're planning for the future. We're preparing for the future. So should the regulator. Just to put on my other hat on broadcasting, it's like 10 years ago where people were saying that over-the-top is not a substitute for cable, and we obviously know that not to be true.
Yeah. Yeah, I would offer there is, the forward-looking is key. The technology substitution, there are countries where their primary service, because of their uniqueness of location or their uniqueness of their competitive landscape, where wireless-only providers have offered and are actually growing faster in certain countries around the world. And so I see this through, the connections with the other CTOs around the world. Some have chosen the technologies. Once again, you need the whole infrastructure. So you need access to spectrum. You don't have spectrum caps in those countries. You have wide open build capabilities. And in those countries, it's incredibly competitive what's happened. So I wouldn't underestimate technology in the future.
Thank you. A variation of the Goldilocks question that I've been asking all week. This is Thursday's the day where I start to sound like a broken record. But you had spoken about if getting the rates right, and if the rates are right, then the wholesale regime could work. I don't want to overstate your position. And I get that, that is definitely one half of the equation. For the wholesale regime to work, it should compensate you for your cost and continue to incentivize investment. But from a public policy perspective, for the wholesale framework to work, it has to do more than that. It also actually has to make additional competitive choice available to consumers, keep downward pressure on pricing, give consumers something to choose that meets their needs. So what are your thoughts on how much space there is, given a rate that satisfies your half of the Goldilocks equation? Is there any space, once your costs are accounted for, can somebody realistically come in, take a compensatory cost-based rate, and still compete using that rate in a way that benefits Canadians?
Yes. So, I was prepared for this question. Don't worry, you don't sound like a broken record, and I'm glad you mixed it up a bit in the way you've presented it to us. So certainly, it won't surprise you that our view that the so-called Goldilocks rate is the cost-based compensatory rate that's reflected in our Phase 2 costing. That is the Goldilocks rate. And the second part of your question, does it work? It has worked. We've, for the most part, over the past several years, with the rates that have been presented to the Commission that are largely cost-based, resellers have grabbed market share. they have had an impact on the market. So it is working. Again, I'll come back to the point. Consumers are primarily going to benefit from, and this is me being a broken record, but consumers are going to primarily benefit from facilities-based competition. That's the most important driver of affordable access to next-generation services. You can't undermine those investments. You can't get the rates wrong. That sacrifices that outcome. That's the most important thing to consumers and to competition. Within that still, with appropriate rates, there's actually always going to be a group of consumers who don't want to go with the incumbent and want to explore other options. And with cost-based rates, resellers are going to be that option. Good?
Yeah, good.
Good. Great, thank you. And then a related question, and Madam Chair, for planning purposes, I think this will be my last one. The notion of below-cost retail pricing. I think, would you agree that it makes it incredibly difficult for wholesale providers to compete in the market when they're faced with below-cost pricing from the network operator, especially when that pricing can be targeted? We heard from Beatonfield today that sometimes the targeting is very specific. Does that distort the playing field? Is that counter to our goals in terms of advancing competition?
I'll start, and then I'm going to ask Howard to weigh in. I think there's a question there, and I don't want to use the phrase predatory pricing, but I think that's where you're taking us, so I might as well have that conversation. We price, and I think Kendall can confirm this, we price based on a number of factors. We need to recover our investments, and we need to compete primarily with the telcos. We never design pricing based on a strategy that would in any way resemble what's been described as predatory pricing. I don't think we have a market where that strategy, even if anyone were to adopt it, would be effective or would kind of fit the test of the Competition Bureau for predatory pricing. As far as whether with the rates proposed, do they reflect costs and can resellers compete?
Yeah, I mean, our costs generally reflect our costs. So the proposed tariff rates that we give, or the existing tariff rates, because we have a lot of wholesale customers on our network right now, generally reflect what our costs are. The issue, those retail rates, is a little more complicated in that some of the people who have come before you so far this week have tried to look at retail rates, look at the promotional rates, right? They look at the Boxing Day sale or something, and then try to suggest that somehow those are below our costs. And I think what's really important is to look at what is the average retail price. That is the more accurate depiction of exactly what's happening in the retail market. And I think especially on our network, if you look at all our wholesale customers, you'll see that the tariffs are below the average retail price. The other thing you have to remember is for retail prices, we don't look at an individual customer on an individual plan at a singular moment in time. We look at the lifetime value of this customer. What product do they have today? What product are they going to order tomorrow? Are they going to upgrade their service? Are they going to buy another product? Are they going to have a family and have more lines on the account? So there's a whole revenue stream that this customer actually can generate. The difference with the wholesale revenue is that all we can get is that wholesale customer at that given moment of time. We don't have the relationship with the customer. There's no potential for us to generate more revenue. So we have to recover our costs through the wholesale rate. The wholesaler, however, does have that direct relationship. They can't upsell. They can't sell other products and services. They can't take a long-term view to that customer. So there is definitely a business and a margin to be made. You see it because all the successful wholesalers are already out there that have been out there taking share over the last few years. So I don't think that this idea that the rates are below cost is accurate, that there's no room for wholesalers, because there has been room. We have seen it.
Okay, to help us put some more meat on that bone, I've asked some of the other network operators for an undertaking. They won't let me install a VPN on my laptop here, so I'm actually not able to get live pricing because you don't have facilities on here. But maybe could you take a 1 gigabit per second service, undertake to provide us information on what your rack rate is, your other various price points at which you sell that service, and a sense of the number of customers to whom you sell at those various price points?
Yes, we'll take that undertaking.
Thank you. Madam Chair, that's it for me.
Okay. Maybe I can just follow up on that question before we take a short break, because I would like to turn things over to Commissioner Naidu after the break. Maybe just looking at it from a bit of a different perspective, and truly from a competition perspective, and parking, anything about predatory pricing. And Tech Savvy will be here tomorrow. They've already shared with us, examples, and they're not the only ones of, retail rates being less than half of the wholesale rate. Should we not be concerned at the commission with the ability of ISPs to compete in that kind of scenario where the retail rate is less than half the wholesale rate?
I think you have to be very careful about looking at specific tiers and specific rates instead of looking across the portfolio of products and tiers that are offered to a reseller. And across our tiers, it's absolutely the case that resellers have margin and can build margin and profitably compete in the market. That's actually kind of, I don't know if I want to put Richard Feasy on the spot, but I mean, that's actually the approach that European regulators have taken, where they pay closer attention to whether a reseller can be profitable across all of its services. Richard, do you mind weighing in a bit there?
No, sure. So precisely that. I mean, one of the challenges in Europe that we found was that if you have a very rigid and very siloed approach to assessing the relationship between retail revenues and input costs for the wholesalers, then you impose a lot of rigidity on the sort of pricing practices, both of the wholesale providers and also to some extent the competitors, particularly with new technologies and new services like gigabit services, where there's a lot of uncertainty about the willingness to pay of customers for different types, different speeds, and different types of services. You want to try and avoid creating a regulatory framework which inhibits the ability of firms to experiment with different prices, including penetration pricing and things of that kind. So the way the Europeans have addressed that is really to have regard for the economic space in which the wholesalers can compete, but thinking about the ability of a wholesaler competing across the portfolio of services and competing over time. So there's not an objective to ensure that you can compete in every particular niche or on every particular product. But the expectation is that you do have to have concern if you've got this sort of regime, that there is enough economic space for sustainable competition over time. And that's really, but the key point I would make, I guess, is that that needs to enable, in designing that, the market as a whole to experiment with pricing, because we're dealing with quite uncertain demand situations here.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Madam Secretary, do we want to perhaps take a short break?
Absolutely. So we will go for a break and resume at 3:10. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Why don't we just go over to Commissioner Naidu? Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for being here. I think one of the advantages of being here on a Thursday afternoon in a week-long hearing is that you actually get to have heard what some of the other interveners have said who've come before us earlier in the week. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the things that we heard from the other interveners so far. I'm going to start off with Bell. They told us yesterday, you probably saw this, that they're now selling internet over cable in areas where they have not deployed fiber. Are you experiencing this dynamic? And if you are, to what extent? And does it have any impact at all on your competitive strategy?
Sure. So maybe I'll take at least the first part of the question. Yes, we have seen that, both in the east and the west through the couple of acquisitions that they've done. For the most part, it's been status quo. We've noticed some increase in out of territory, but by and large, it's been status quo as what we've seen from the resellers historically.
Yeah, and just to address the strategy question, so as of right now, it hasn't impacted our strategy. We compete locally with any provider that's there, and that would include Bell showing up as a smaller ISP under a different brand. So to date, no changes.
All right, thank you. Bell also said yesterday that they get a competitive advantage whenever they upgrade a house to fiber. Would you agree with that? And how do you adapt when Bell builds fiber into a neighborhood that you're currently serving?
Well, I can talk to the technology part. So the legacy infrastructure that was in place, and I think some of the other operators shared, it was built for the telephone network. So it's unshielded, twisted copper loops. It has a limitation in speed. And so they were faced with a bit of a technology challenge that technology is end of life, obsolete. They had to invest. And so from their perspective, they chose, instead of upgrading to other technologies, maybe GFast or others, they went fiber to the home. In our case, as I say, we already have fiber into all the neighborhoods. So I'm already very similar structure where you have fiber, in our case, to a node, they have fiber to what's called an OLT, and then they passive connect to the home. And they share. That's the thing. It's not dedicated fiber. It's actually shared. The houses are all sharing the port. So, you know, from a competitive standpoint, we line ourselves up fine against that infrastructure. And as we upgrade and the investments that we're making with DOCSIS 4, think of fiber and DOCSIS 4 as the same in terms of being able to deliver 10 gigabit services to every house that we're connected to.
And I think just to build from what Ron was saying, for us, like he said, we've got the speeds that consumers absolutely need, and we spend more time focusing on the attributes that consumers really care about. So that's reliable, fast, secure, and so for us, absolutely, they're different technologies, but they deliver what the consumer needs in the home, and then it's everything inside of the home is where you can really differentiate yourself, and so we really focus on that.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to Cogeco. They had told us this morning that nearly 50% of their wholesale subscribers are now end customers of Bell, TELUS, or Rogers. So I'm wondering if you can help us to understand what the sudden interest in wholesale access is.
Well, I'll start and maybe ask Christine to add. I think they said Bell, TELUS, and Rogers, but I think when you talk about the resale regime, it's predominantly Bell and TELUS, and to a much lower extent, it's Rogers. As we said repeatedly, we're builders, and we prefer to compete with our own facilities.
Sure, and I think maybe this ties back to the question around acquisitions. So we have seen a number of acquisitions of ISPs, and as we've heard earlier this week, I think that there's a number of different reasons behind that. I think if we were to compare with Cogeco, if we were to look at our TPIA base, it would be roughly about 30 or so % of that is now owned by facilities-based providers.
And I do just want to further explain some of the questions you're asking about Bell exploring resale on our networks, or us exploring resale, and what the competitive impact has been, because it might go back to our earlier discussion about why we're opposed to the TELUS exclusion as they've modeled it, and what the impact would be. Currently, with the rates that are in the market, the competition that they're provided, even as a reseller, has been effective competition as a reseller based on the costs that exist in the market. They're still primarily acting as facilities-based players, but if we're looking at potential impacts, if incentives changed or asymmetries were created, like the model proposed by TELUS, if they were to start reselling in our market, we think that, especially with the potential for below-cost rates, or even without below-cost rates, the incentives would actually do real harm, potentially, to competition and investment, and not to the benefit of consumers.
TELUS yesterday said that there is no national market for internet service. There are no national incumbents, they said. TELUS argues that it should be considered a new entrant with respect to Ontario and most of Quebec. I'm wondering what your response is to that and whether or not you agree.
Well, as we've explained, and I think others have explained, we do not agree with that position in terms of TELUS being a new entrant. Certainly, it's not a national market. We don't have a national broadband market. There are local and regional markets that are all intensely competitive. So there's no link between TELUS's position that it's a national market to suggest that there's no national market to suggest that it is, as they describe, this new entrant in other parts of the country. TELUS does have a national presence, even if the markets are not national.
Okay, thank you for that. TELUS also said yesterday that they were saying that the larger companies are exactly who the Commission should be prioritizing for wholesale access because of the competition that they can bring to the market, they were arguing. You have a different view, that large incumbents are precisely the ones who should be excluded from wholesale access. So given that a number of wholesale-based competitors have been acquired in recent years, how can we be sure that consumers will have enough choice and competition if we were to prohibit larger companies from wholesale access?
Well, I'll start with the fact that we have, as we said, a highly competitive market with intense competition between cable and ILECs, other wholesale providers, potential new entrants looking ahead to the future, and that's all good for Canadians, and it's good for competition. And I want to explore the TELUS proposal that you have to look to players like TELUS to provide wholesale. And I think this echoes some of the comments expressed by Kojiko earlier. You have to go back to what the original intent and rationale behind the wholesale framework was. It was to provide small new entrants with an opportunity to enter, gain market share, and build, hopefully with a disaggregated regime. You enter, and then you make your own investments, then you build your own facilities, and then competition thrives. I'm alarmed by any suggestion that we would go in the complete opposite direction and say that builders like Rogers, and quite honestly like Bell in the way they expressed it yesterday, should be incented or forced to stop building and instead resell. So the idea that you're going to abandon the rationale for wholesale in support of this notion of making facilities-based carriers abandon their investments and instead just ride on someone else's network is antithetical to the entire original basis for the wholesale regime and incredibly harmful to competition going forward and incredibly harmful to consumers.
Thank you for answering my questions. Those are all the questions that I have, but I know my colleagues have questions as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner Naidu. Maybe we can just pick up where you left off right now, saying that it's a highly competitive market. As you know, because I'm sure you've been following the proceeding, we have heard from other interveners that it is not a highly competitive market. We've heard that competition drives lower prices, more choice, innovation, all these great things. And when it comes to consumers, that is not what is being represented to us. We've heard from PIAC on Monday, we heard from Open Media, we heard from Manitoba Coalition and others that Canadians are frustrated, in some cases desperate. I think Vice Chair Scott referred to one of the stories that we heard about where somebody's sort of having to choose kind of internet over food, feel that the internet is less affordable today. So can you respond to that or help us reconcile those views?
Well, we certainly understand the concerns of consumers, and we're sympathetic to their views in an inflationary environment. We can't deny the fact that there is inflation, and it's impacting a number of products and services. It's not actually impacting broadband in the same way. In fact, as we've demonstrated and others have demonstrated, prices for broadband are going down, especially at a price per gigabyte level, which reflects the fact that we're investing to compete and to deliver affordable access to next generation services, which is vital to the needs of Canadians. And we also continue to offer a variety of plans, including low-cost plans. We offer a Connected for Success plan, so we are committed to serving all our customers, including those who are in financial need. You're referring to, I think, survey data, and of course, when customers are surveyed, you know, are you happy with your prices? Do you wish prices were lower? You know what the answer is for any product and service. But I don't think that's the data upon which you should rely.
Okay, thank you for that. You've talked a lot about asymmetry, and you have said that there has been asymmetry for a long time. Wouldn't requiring both telcos and cable companies to offer wholesale access to all end users connected to their respective wireline networks be a good way to establish regulatory symmetry?
Let me, if you don't mind, Chairperson Trees, let me understand exactly what you're proposing. Are you saying, shouldn't we just mandate wholesale access across the board, which I think is what's being proposed in this proceeding? I think for a variety of reasons, we think there's logic in support of phasing out wholesale access, and there still would be the opportunity for off-tariff agreements. But again, you're right, if you do continue to mandate wholesale access, it should be symmetrical and would be technologically neutral. And I think the best way to establish that is, as we've said, one regime for cable, HFC, that's subject to the wholesale regime, and one regime for telco, FTTP, that's subject to the wholesale regime. And ideally, you'd get it right in terms of level of aggregation, so you would make sure that those who are choosing to resell would be in some way incented to make some investments, and we wouldn't have both an aggregated and disaggregated regime. I think we'd prefer to continue to incent or support disaggregation. Howard, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think if you see our proposal for the aggregated regime, we took multiple poise in provinces like 4 to 5 in Alberta and BC, and about 9 or 10 in Ontario and Quebec, which we feel would at least keep some of the intention behind the original regime, which was to transition from aggregate to disaggregated. It would incent the wholesalers to deploy some capital, make some investments on their network, and take some ownership in the products and services that they offer. So it would keep a little bit of the spirit alive from the original decision, even as you move back towards more of an aggregated model.
Okay, thank you for that. Perhaps I could ask you about FTTN and what we heard from Bell and what we heard from TELUS, and perhaps you could react to that. So Bell doesn't challenge the continued mandated status of aggregated FTTN services, but recommends that we freeze the FTTN rates. TELUS suggested that an FTTN service be discontinued in areas where FTTP exists, with FTTP rates applied to any remaining FTTN customers in those areas. I'm wondering what your view is on these proposals, and if one were adopted, should it apply to ILECs, cable companies, or both?
Well, it's not a proposal. I might ask a technology question to Ron. It's not a proposal that can be applied necessarily symmetrically, because you know, what they describe as FTTN is their legacy copper, and they're, you know, overbuilding with FTTP, which is different from what we're doing on the cable side, which is continuing to upgrade, enhance our existing DOCSIS 3.1 and building toward 4.0. So without commenting directly on their specific ask for exemptions on the rates that are specific to them, I can tell you that the rationale behind decommissioning is different for the two technologies. I don't know if Ron, you want to talk about the technologies, and Howard might add something about decommissioning.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the old DSL is what it is, and so it's fiber to what's called a DSLAM, digital subscriber access loop. And that's basically leveraging the copper loops that go to your house. It's just leveraging the old infrastructure that was in place. But that's for being able to deliver basic services. So, you know, it still has a viable use up to a certain speed. And that's that infrastructure has been there for a long time, but it's very different from a DOCSIS infrastructure, which is fiber direct to the node, and then your serving groups from the house are right from that node. So it's a very different, between the two architectures, they're very different. Fiber to the home is a lot closer to what we do with DOCSIS. It's fiber out to, in the case of fiber to the home, it's what's called an OLT, an optical line terminal. And then that's the powered unit that goes in your neighborhood. And then it's passive fiber that you share with, 64 of your neighbors or 32 of your neighbors are shared on that port. Our nodes are very similar to that type of a structure to an OLT. So it's what they're talking about is kind of, I've never kind of thought of it as fiber to the node, or fiber to the curb. It's old DSL is what it is.
And just from a decommissioning standpoint, what they're doing is more of a wholesale change, right? They're moving from copper to fiber to the home. We're not doing that. We're taking our current DOCSIS structure and we're just upgrading it. So we're not going to be decommissioning. We're just going to be build on top of our current network and make it even better. So we have no plans to decommission any portions of our network. There are a couple of instances that do arise from time to time, usually resulting from some developer or landlord that is renovating and our wires are impacted, or perhaps some of our wires got degraded because of exposure to weather. But those are uncommon. For the most part, we will just continue to build upon our current network and make it even better.
And I don't want you to miss the fact that that investment that we're making in DOCSIS is as expensive as the investment they're making. So don't assume that it's an easy task, especially when we're going from DOCSIS 3.1 to 4.0. It is a massive investment that is not unlike the investment that the ILECs are making in FTTP.
Okay, thank you for that. I only have two other questions, and I'll look around to see if my colleagues have anything additional before we turn it back over to you. We talked about investment, and we had a discussion. You had a discussion with the panel. Is there anything else on investment that you would like to share with us? I mean, we've heard about the challenges. We've heard about rural and remote communities and how difficult it is, to get there. We've heard about interest rates. We've heard a lot this week. Is there anything else that we didn't cover when we were talking about investment that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, the one in particular I know I brought up earlier, and I'll keep coming back to this. Maybe unlike some other operators that have presented to you, we're builders. I'm building more last year than we have ever done in terms of service expansion, modernization of homes. This year will be a record year for us again in terms of our capital investment and our year of investment in upgrading the infrastructure. Access to pole duct structures and making it a fair playing field, that if I could get access to poles the same way the ILECs do, if I could get access to duct structures the way the ILECs do, that's a level playing field. I think the Commission could go miles to help competitive landscape change, all builders, and then you're incenting infrastructure, and more importantly, we can go faster. We can go way faster in terms of serving communities, because right now I'm having to go out on my own and do it. And so it would make a dramatic difference in the Canadian landscape if you took that challenge on.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So my last question is around the recent acquisitions of competitors. We've heard a lot about that this week as well. Completely different views about what's happening and why that's happening. We've heard it's because the wholesale system is failing. We've heard that it's evidence of success, not failure, was what we heard from TELUS. I'm wondering if you could provide your views on this.
Yeah, and I'll address it in sort of the two ways it's been presented to interveners. One is, what does it say about the state of competition in the market? And I would say it still indicates that we have a thriving competitive market. We're talking about companies that have gained significant share, earned a valuation of their company. They were built by entrepreneurs, and they've chosen to sell their company, which is entirely their right to do. The second part of that is, even though they've been acquired, there are still hundreds of resellers out there, so there's still there's still a thriving competitive market, including through competition offered by resellers. So those acquisitions are neither reflective of the market not being competitive, and nor is it, as a consequence, a less competitive market. The other part of that is you asked about what does it mean for the wholesale regime. I think the worst thing you can do is if you're, I mean, this is already a pretty interventionist wholesale regime. So the worst thing you can do is decide that you're unhappy with certain market outcomes and then become even more intrusive and add even more onerous regulations. So the response can't be more regulation, more intervention.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just looking around to see if there's anything further from the panel. No. So thank you. We will turn things back over to you for concluding remarks.
Thank you, Chairperson of Treaties. I know Ron is going to add a few comments as well. We know this is a challenging task in front of you. There's a wide range of opinions, and we're here to obviously try and support you in that decision-making. As always, Rogers wants to come before you with thoughtful positions and have a candid discussion about our proposals and the proposals of others, because we're working toward the shared commitment of building a world-class communication system that benefits all Canadians in the Canadian economy. And obviously, you've heard from us already. You're going to hear from us again. The best way to deliver affordable access to next-generation services and deliver what Canadians need is through facilities-based competition and a framework that supports continued investment. I've also heard it said that you have to balance objectives or choose among objectives. We've always believed that affordability, investment, innovation, competition are complementary objectives that can be achieved with the right framework and obviously the correct reliance on facilities-based competition, which lets us continue to invest. We're builders. We want to invest. We want to deliver services to Canadians. And I can't overstate the risks if you get this wrong. And if the rates are below cost, if the rates are distortionary, if you exacerbate the asymmetries or introduce new asymmetries between cable and telco, you will significantly undermine investment and competition that will harm Canadians, and we urge you against that. Let us build, let us invest, and then you can do what Ron wants to do.
Well, first to the Commissioner, I appreciate the opportunity. It's not a normal place for your technology lead to come out and spend time with you, and so I appreciate the opportunity to engage. As everybody here has said, and maybe what's different about us being in front of you, we're builders. We are on a pace right now that is the largest modernization, service expansion, network coverage expansion that we've ever been on. We did it last year. We're going to do it again this year. We're probably going to spend CapEx that exceeds our other operators. And that is a focus on delivering to serve all Canadians. That massive investment, also, once that foundation is there, what I am so excited about is bringing the innovations to Canada. One of the opportunities I have the privilege of being part of is I chair the technical committee of Cable Labs. Cable Labs is our industry association and our standards bodies for all of our industry. It's got representatives from Japan, from the UK, from Germany, from Latin America, all my fellow US operators at Cox, Comcast, Charter. It's all the CTOs, and we chair that technical committee. We're leading the innovation of what you can do with infrastructure. That organization has over 600 patents. That's the research Canada used to have in the telephone network. And we want to bring that back to Canada. And we're passionate about building, passionate about innovation, and I think there's an enormous opportunity, if we get this right, to actually drive investments that deliver productivity and connectivity for all Canadians. And I think the biggest thing I would ask is, let's get the framework right. Let's continue to encourage investment, because that's our competitive differentiation as a nation. And I think that innovation will set up generations ahead. And that's the part that I would love the Commission to remember as you're thinking this through. Think about generations ahead. Think about innovation. Think about the foundation of what we can do as an industry. Let's go build.
On behalf of the panel, I would like to thank Rogers. We've very much appreciated the discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. This concludes today's agenda, so the hearing is therefore adjourned for the day, and we will resume tomorrow at 9 a.m. Thank you.